Hello and welcome back. This is part 2 of the week 6 lecture. So if you watched part 1, you already understand that we're doing things a little bit differently this week. I just wanted to give you guys all of this information that you're going to need for the upcoming extended summary assignment, which is going to be due at the end of week 7. So I'm not going to post a lecture next week. I'm going to be a little bit pressed for time. I have some other things going on outside of class, still school related, but not teaching related. So I just thought it would be best if I could get everything that you need for the upcoming assignment posted here in week 6. So you have plenty of time to work on that extended summary. Again, it's due at the end of week 7, but you're going to need some time to put it together. So we've already talked about summarizing. That was all that part 1 focused on. So here in part 2, I want to shift over to paraphrasing and quoting. These are the other two really essential skills that kind of go along with summarizing. These are basic, foundational, vital tools that we're going to need not just in this class, but also in future classes. And we're certainly going to need them when we start putting together our research papers. So I've already covered summaries. Let's jump into these new techniques that are really important for us, paraphrasing and providing correct and correctly punctuated direct quotations. So let's start with paraphrasing. Sometimes people act like paraphrasing and summarizing are the same thing. Sometimes these terms are used somewhat interchangeably, and that is a problem because these are two different things. These are two different techniques. They have some things in common. Primarily, the thing they have in common is the fact that they are both written in the research paper writer's own words. So we're not quoting our authors yet. Okay, we are putting all of our paraphrases, just like all of our summaries, in our own words. But they're quite different in almost every respect. So you remember we talked about how summaries are shortened or condensed versions of the original source text. We're only focusing on the highlights. We're only focusing on the main ideas when we summarize. And we're cutting a bunch of other stuff out. We've already discussed that. Well, paraphrases are very different. Paraphrases are not shorter than the original source text. They are often going to be essentially the same length. So you're not altering the length. You're not altering the substance of the original source text. Instead, you're doing what I often call a sort of translating type of work. You're taking the author's words. You're taking often very complex ideas, things that might not be familiar to a lot of regular people. So you're taking complex ideas, maybe complicated language as well, and you're going to translate that stuff into your own language, your own words. You're going to choose simpler words in some cases, or you might need to write simpler, more clear sentences, just to make this stuff easier to understand both for you and for your audience. So this is sort of like a way to translate from the author's language and put it into your language. So that might help. You're using your own voice here, but again, the paraphrase is going to be roughly the same length as whatever it is you're paraphrasing in the original source text. So you're not cutting stuff out now. You're not only focusing on what you think to be the most important parts of a paragraph or an essay. If you're going to paraphrase, you need to be accurate and thorough. And again, you don't want to change the substance of the original source text. You're not cutting, you're not condensing, you're simply putting it into your own words. So obviously when we paraphrase, we don't typically paraphrase entire articles or entire books because obviously that would take a very long time. So that's another key difference to keep in mind when we're talking about summaries and paraphrases. We can summarize anything. We can summarize books, articles, websites. We can summarize long stuff, short stuff, medium length stuff. There's really no limit. Paraphrasing is used a bit more selectively. Okay, we don't want to paraphrase a really long article, but we might want to paraphrase a couple of sentences from that article. Maybe we want to paraphrase a short paragraph from that article, and maybe we just want to tackle one or two sentences. So like I said, we have some choices, but we're going to take a smaller chunk of the original source text to paraphrase. We're not going to try to tackle the entire thing unless it's obviously a very short source. Maybe we could paraphrase a one-page article or a half-page article, something that's really short. Yeah, we could do that. But typically, we're only going to paraphrase certain parts of our sources, not entire sources. So one thing I like to sort of consider as we sort of learn about and remember paraphrases is these are kind of an alternative to quoting. And we're going to talk more about quoting in a few moments. But if you find a particular sentence or a couple of sentences in one of your source texts that you really like, or they seem to be expressing a really important idea or a really interesting possibility, you want to capture those ideas. You want to capture what the author is doing in those sentences. You basically have two choices. If you really want to capture that stuff without sort of shrinking it down or, putting it into a summary, you have two options. You can go with a paraphrase or you can go with a direct quote. And if you just really like how something sounds, and you don't think you can say it any better yourself, then I always recommend using a direct quote. And again, we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But if you like the ideas, if you think the sentences are important and good, but maybe the language is very elaborate, maybe it's very complex. Maybe it took you a couple of minutes to kind of figure out what the author was actually saying in those sentences, and you're not really sure if the quote is going to land for all of your readers. Because again, maybe the language is complex, maybe it's just that the ideas are complex and you need to maybe simplify the way it's arranged. Again, you don't want to take anything out, but you can write your own sentences that are simpler and shorter and perhaps more direct and more precise than the sentences that you see in your source text. So this is just a way to capture those sentences without necessarily quoting them. Okay, but in some cases you might want to quote, but in other situations you're going to prefer a paraphrase. It's just another tool to add to our tool belts. So again, the substance does not change when you're paraphrasing, just the words do. And the arrangement of the words. Your actual sentence structure can change, but you're not cutting, you're not shrinking. So for a good example, take a look at the one of the PDFs I posted. I've actually added it recently to the week 6 module. It's just called, I think, Paraphrase Example. You should see the PDF on the main module page. I just wanted to show you guys an example of sort of how this works. So I pulled this from an old textbook. It's a nice visual to go along with what I'm saying about paraphrasing. So take a look at the two passages on this page. It's just a one-page document, so you shouldn't have to look hard. We have the original passage, and then we have a paraphrase of that original passage. Just take a moment. You can pause me, or I'll just shut up for a moment. Just take a look at those two passages, starting with the original. Just kind of skim it. Get a feel for the language. And then turn over to the paraphrase and skim that. And try to notice a few obvious changes in terms of word choice, sentence structure. Look at how the student is taking these complex ideas and translating them into his or her own student language. So let's just kind of walk through this sentence by sentence. We don't have to go through the whole thing, but let me just show you a couple of sentences, starting with the first one in the original passage. Notice that this is a pretty short sentence. When you first arrive on these shores, you are in mourning. Mourning like expressing grief over the death of a loved one, not the time of day. Okay, just to be clear. Okay, so that's the first sentence in the original source text. Now, look at the paraphrased version of that first sentence. I want you to notice that the student's sentence, the sentence that the student has written as a part of their paraphrase, is actually longer than the original in the original passage, because the student is putting these ideas into simpler language. And that involves, in this case, some additional words. So one thing you're going to notice from the original is there's not a lot of explanation. Like, if I've never read this entire article or book that the original passage is coming from, I'm not really going to know why people first arriving in this country are in mourning. It's not immediately made clear in the original. Now, of course, if we read the entire original, I'm sure it would be made clear. But again, remember, you're writing as a research paper writer. You are writing for an audience that has not seen your sources. That's one of the most important things to kind of understand about the work that we're doing in this class. I'm not going to read your sources. Most other people who read your work will have not read your sources. See, this is why paraphrasing is an important skill, because sometimes, like I said earlier, you're not just translating the complex language into a simpler language for you, you're doing it for your readers as well, because we're not going to understand everything that's going on in that original source text. So look at the paraphrase. Look at the first sentence in the paraphrase. New immigrants to America feel the loss of their friends, family, and culture. Codrescu, the author of the original, compares this sense of loss to mourning a death. So do you see what the student is doing? Do you see how the student is adding a little bit more detail? A little bit more in the way of explanation? That's what we do when we paraphrase. The student is explaining why new immigrants coming to the country feel this sense of mourning. The student explains it. Well, they've lost their friends, they've lost their family, and in many cases, they've perhaps lost their culture. So that's made clear in Codrescu's larger piece, but it's not made clear in the first sentence of this passage that we are paraphrasing. So the student needs to make it clear. The student actually needs to add some additional words to make it clear. And it actually takes the student 2 sentences to really account for the first sentence in the original. And if you guys can see, I'm not sure if it shows up very well in the PDF, but the editors of the book use kind of like a color coding system so you can match up the sentences in the original with the sentences in the paraphrase. So again, the student had to write 2 sentences in order to paraphrase just 1 short sentence from the original. But that's fine. I mean, if that's what you need to do, that's what you need to do. Now let's move on to the second sentence in the original. And I don't have to read this to you. You guys can read for yourselves. But look at that second sentence, okay? And then look over it back at the paraphrase. And once again, we're kind of adding a little bit of detail and explanation. And if you look at the entire paraphrase as a whole, it is a little bit longer than the original, but not a lot longer. You don't want to add a ton. Again, we want the length of the paraphrase to be very close to the length of the original. So it can be a sentence shorter or maybe a couple of sentences longer, but you don't want it to be a lot shorter or a lot longer, because then you're doing something else. If you want to paraphrase, you need to keep the length very close to what it originally was. So again, you're not taking out ideas. You're not cutting details. You're simply putting the author's words into your words. And sometimes that might require an additional sentence or two, or just some additional explanation and detail. You guys really need to consider that. A lot of your sources are complicated, difficult, weird, unfamiliar to many normal humans. So one of your biggest jobs as a research paper writer is to make your source information clear and easy to understand for all of your readers. And paraphrasing is a great way to do that. Okay, so let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about quoting. Now, we're going to return to a lot of these quoting rules later because inevitably a lot of you guys are going to get them wrong and make a series of mistakes. That's normal. That's okay. That's how we learn. But there is kind of an art or maybe even a science to providing good direct quotations. So I'm going to give you guys some rules. I'm going to go over some basics, but please don't be hard on yourselves if you don't feel like you've mastered proper direct quotation style right away. It's kind of an ongoing thing. It took me years to become really proficient at it. So we're learning. We don't need to master it immediately, but we need to understand some of the basic rules. Okay, so obviously, let's just get a definition for starters. Obviously, when we quote, we are using an author's exact words. So summarizing and paraphrasing are ways to take the author's language and put it in our own language. Ways to kind of, in various ways, more so with summary, but also with paraphrase, we're kind of altering the original source material. We're either shortening it and putting it into our own words, or we're at least putting it into our own words, if nothing else. But quoting is a different kind of thing. With quoting, being true and faithful to the author is important. We need to make sure we are accurately capturing their exact words. We need to make sure that we are punctuating the direct quote properly, because if we don't, we're going to run into some big problems. And we also need to make sure that we're checking all of these other boxes. When we directly quote, there are a lot of moving parts. We have to be conscious of punctuation, citation, and I'll talk more about that, and overall clarity. So if we're sloppy, if we're not paying attention to what we're doing, our direct quotes are not going to work, and they're going to actually hurt us in various ways. And if you're really careless and you don't put quotation marks around your direct quotes, you might end up getting accused of plagiarism. So doing direct quotes correctly is very, very important. So let me just go through some of the basics. A lot of this can be found in the week 7 module. I know it's not up yet, but one thing that is up is another document that I posted in the week 6 module, and it's just called Quote Sandwiches. And those are as fun as they sound. And we're about to talk about them. You can look at some examples in that document. So again, we're using the author's exact words here. So anytime you're reading a source and you come across a sentence or maybe just a phrase and you feel like the author is saying that particular thing, expressing that particular idea better than you ever could, then go ahead and quote it. That's a good reason to provide a direct quotation. Like I said, there's going to be a lot of times where you like the ideas, but you think it might actually be better to express those ideas in simpler language. And that's when you paraphrase. But on those occasions where you're just really struck by the author's language, you think it's really powerful, it's really memorable, and you just don't think you could say it any better, that's a good time to provide a direct quote. But of course, remember, when you are providing direct quotations, you must put the author's words in quotation marks so we can tell the difference between the author's words and your words. So here are some other times that it would be a good idea to quote. You're going to want to provide at least some direct quotations as a form of support. So it's not just, oh, that sounds good. You need to find quotations that help to build your argument. So as you're doing research, as you're reading all of these different authors, you need to highlight sentences or maybe even entire paragraphs or phrases, groups of sentences, if you maybe find just 2 or 3 in the middle of a paragraph, whatever. But this is where, again, underlining and highlighting is really important. You need to grab a few really memorable sentences, statements, however, whatever form they appear in. And again, it's nice if they sound good and they also support your points. So obviously they can be used as support. And remember, we talked about testimonials as a type of evidence. Well, you guys are going to need to use testimonials in this way. Especially when we're talking about expert opinion, authorities, scientists, doctors, experts in the field. So when you quote them, yeah, often that's going to be a form of the evidence that you use in your research papers, and that's a very effective way to go. Also, if you're dealing with very specialized language, and this is not going to apply to all of us, but for some of us who have topics that are kind of based in science or technology or even medicine, a lot of specific disciplines have kind of their own jargon. You guys might know that word. Jargon just means a specialized language that's unique to a particular field or profession or even a hobby or something. And a lot of times jargon can be sort of incomprehensible to other people who aren't familiar with that field or that area. So sometimes it can be really hard to paraphrase jargon because you can't really put it in other simpler language because it's very specific and it's very specialized language. So in cases like that, sometimes you just need to quote it and then explain it because a lot of your readers aren't going to know what the hell you're talking about. Okay, but if your authors are using, terminology specific to particular fields, quoting is a good idea. This will often come up, like I said, with science, technology, medicine. They all have their own jargons. And then finally, responding to a source. Now, we're not ready to start doing this yet, but eventually we will do this. And when you're responding directly to people who are on the other side of the debate from you, remember, you're dealing with debatable issues, controversial topics. So you're going to have opponents. You're going to have people on the other side that you will need to respond to eventually in your research papers. So when you do that, you need to sometimes quote them. You need to accurately address what they're saying. And a real problem, I think, in our current society is people don't really listen to one another when they're arguing. People are so eager to just make their own points, they're not listening to what their opponent says. So then when they respond to their opponent, they're not really being fair to the opponent's argument. They're just yelling and they're angry, and they're not actually addressing what their opponent said. And I think everybody is guilty of that to some extent. So we're going to avoid that by sometimes quoting our opponents, taking their exact words, and then responding to them and saying, you're wrong, and here's why. But I'm actually addressing what you said, not some fictional version of what you said. So we're going to be accurate in that regard. So when we're doing that, sometimes we need to grab a little bit of our opponent's own words so we can show that we've done our homework, that we are quoting them accurately, and we have good responses to their opinions or positions. So this is kind of part of our credibility. When we quote effectively, and especially when we quote our opponents and respond to them well, we're showing our credibility. We're showing our knowledge. I've done my homework. I know what the other side says. I know their positions, and I know why they're wrong. This is another way to make ourselves authorities, to make ourselves trustworthy and reliable to our readers. Okay, so there are a lot of rules that go into direct quotations. So I don't expect us to remember all of this, but I've posted a lot of it in the week 7 module. So again, as you're working on your extended summaries, which will include paraphrases and direct quotations, pay attention to my rules. I walk you through all that stuff in the overview, and you can also take a look at that quote sandwich document. So let me get into the quote sandwich concept. It's the easiest way I've ever found of thinking about the right way to do quotations. So think about a sandwich. We all know how a sandwich works. Typically, we're going to have 2 slices of bread, a top slice and a bottom slice. And then we're going to have whatever meat or filling we like in the middle of our sandwich. So those are the 3 basic components of a sandwich. Top slice of bread, the meat, or maybe PB&J or whatever you like, and then the bottom slice. So think about that basic sandwich structure as you start thinking about writing your own direct quotations, because we're going to use the sandwich to guide us. So when you are using direct quotes, you need to have this in your mind, okay? The quote is the meat or the PB and J. The quote is the featured attraction. It is the most important part. But as we know, we still need the bread. We still need our top and bottom slices of bread. So I want you to think of your quotations as the meat. And then I want you to think of the top slice of bread as being your introduction to the quote. So the introduction to the quote is what we think of as the top slice of bread in our sandwich. And then after the quote itself appears, we're going to have a bottom slice of bread that will serve as the explanation of the quote. Now, in some cases, you might not need to really explain it. It might be fairly obvious or self-explanatory, but you have to follow up on the quote in some kind of way. So if you're not necessarily explaining it, you're at least commenting on it. You have something to say about it. You're going to show us why it matters. You're going to do something with it. That's an important part of quoting. Don't just throw quotes in for the hell of it. Don't just do it to take up space. The quotes need to serve a purpose. They need to support your argument or illustrate the other side of the debate so you can take them on. Otherwise, why are we doing it? Okay, so if you look at that document, look at the quote sandwich document. I'm giving you sample sentences and phrases that you can use as the top slice of bread. And then I'm showing you some examples of what you can use as bottom slice. So those are the ways that we explain or follow up on the quote. So the reason I like to emphasize this approach is because students naturally have a tendency to do what we in the English business refer to as quote bombs. I don't know if you guys have ever heard that term. It might sound fun, but we don't mean it in a fun way. A quote bomb is when a student simply drops a direct quote into their paper with no introduction, no explanation, no clear reason why. The quote is just there, like it just drops from the sky. And the readers, namely me and other instructors, were left to figure out why is this quote here? What am I supposed to make of this quote? What is this quote supposed to be doing? You don't want your readers asking those kinds of questions, okay? So we want to avoid the quote bomb. And by writing quote sandwiches, we're always going to have a clear structure that makes it quite obvious to our readers both why we're using the quote, who said the quote, how the quote is differentiated from the rest of our stuff. All of that's going to be made clear if we simply use the quote sandwich format. So we're going to keep working with these, but just take a look at my samples, and you're going to notice if we start with just the top slice, if we think about introductions, you're going to notice that most of my introductions are phrases, which means they are not complete sentences. A phrase is a collection of words that could not stand alone as a complete sentence. So oftentimes we will use short phrases to introduce quotes. That's very normal and very easy. But if you go down to the last two examples of my introductions or top slices, you're going to notice that I'm using complete sentences to introduce those last two. All right? So here's a key thing to understand. If you're going to use a short phrase as your top slice of bread, you will simply need a comma between that introductory phrase and the quote itself. And you can see that in my examples. When I'm just using a short phrase, like, as Lackey says, that's a short phrase. All I need is a comma between that introductory phrase and the quote that I'm actually using. And then when the quote is over, okay, when the quote ends, I end my quote marks, and then I have to write an in-text citation, because we always have to cite somebody else's words. We also have to cite other people's ideas. So citations will become important. In-text citations, for the first time for us in this class, become important on this upcoming extended summary. And I'll have a bunch more info in the week 7 module about in-text citations, but you can already see an example in the week 6 overview. These are also called parenthetical citations because they appear inside parentheses. So you need to provide in-text citations whether you are summarizing, paraphrasing, or quoting. And I will make that clear again in week 7. But obviously for right now, as we're just thinking about the basic direct quotation format, we can't forget about the in-text citation, and the in-text citation needs to come at the end of that sentence, the end of the quote. So you end your quote marks where the quote ends, but you don't put your period yet. Instead, you write your in-text citation, and I give you an example. All you need inside the parentheses there will be the last name of the author and a page number. And then after you've closed your parentheses, the period ending that entire sentence comes after the in-text citation, not before. So you close your quotation marks before the in-text citation, and you put the period ending that sentence after the in-text citation, because the in-text citation, along with the quote, is part of the sentence. So the punctuation comes after the quote and after the in-text citation. Okay? And then you start a new sentence, and that new sentence will be your bottom slice of bread. And like I said, in some cases, you'll actually need to explain your quote because it's not going to be immediately obvious or self-explanatory to your readers. In other cases, you don't really have to explain it, but you need to follow up on it, say something about it, and use it in some kind of productive way. But anyway, going back to the top slices very quickly, and then I'll wrap up. If you look at the last two examples for the top slice, you'll notice that I'm using complete sentences to introduce my quotes there. And when I use complete sentences to introduce a quote, I need a colon, the two dots, the colon between my introduction and the quote itself. So for now, just remember that distinction. If we're using a phrase as our top slice of bread, we need a comma between the phrase and the quote. But if we're using a complete sentence as the top slice of bread, we need a colon between that sentence and the quote. So again, look at my examples to see how all of this is supposed to look, all right? And you want yours to look like mine. But again, when we're writing our bottom slice of bread, start a new sentence. That is the simplest, cleanest way to do direct quotations. Sometimes the bottom slice can be included in the previous sentence, but that gets tricky. That gets a little messy, and there's a higher probability that you're going to mess up the punctuation. So I recommend just starting a brand new sentence when you are ready for the bottom slice. And again, I'm showing you some phrases and some sentences that you can use, at least the beginnings of sentences that you can use as your bottom slice. So let's get comfortable with these techniques. What you guys need to do, you have an upcoming research journal that is only going to ask you to summarize. So the week 6 research journal is strictly summary, so you can practice all of those skills. But once you're done with that research journal, I want you to grab one of your sources. Because when you do your extended summary, you're going to be working with one of your own sources. So grab one of your articles or one of your book chapters, and I want you to just start practicing some of this stuff. Write a couple of quote sandwiches. Find a direct quotation or two from that article, from one of your articles that you want to use. And practice writing a quote sandwich using my templates, my examples to guide you. Practice writing a brief paraphrase. Just grab a sentence or two from your article and paraphrase them. Put them in your own words. We have to practice this stuff. So we'll continue to practice. I will not have a week 7 lecture, but I'm still reachable. So if you have questions, problems, concerns, email me. Let's talk. Otherwise, I will see you in week 8.